Okay, it's been 2 weeks since the end of the CrossFit Games, and I take the sport of CrossFit pretty seriously. I enjoy it, and the work I do for it is all because I'm hopeful of the growth and the continued evolution of the sport. So I wanted to take the time that I needed to reflect on it before offering my thoughts. But basically, I'm going to walk through event by event of the games from this past season, 2019 season. And as I do that, I think I'll be able to, reflect on and impart some knowledge, some stats, some analysis, and some feelings about the games this year. I know that everyone has their opinions and their emotions about it, and I'm doing this just as much for me as for potentially any of you, just to kind of get it out there after having 2 weeks to think about it. So I think the only way to start with this games is the opening ceremony. I was involved in the opening ceremony this year. I was there for the athlete registration some of the days, and it was really cool. It was really cool to see the national champions, to see how excited they were to be there, to see the emotion, the passion, the pride that they had to represent their country, the excitement of being at the games. Those are all real, tangible things that you could see in their faces. You could get out of conversations with them. It showed during the ceremonies, and even though I was a little unsure about their inclusion before the weekend, I felt like that experience of being there, of meeting some of them, of seeing them, coupled with what CrossFit chose to program as the first event, which is where I'm going to go next, made the inclusion of national champions this first year that they chose to do that acceptable, okay, and successful in my opinion. So event one. From just a programming standpoint, I thought it was a great event. One of the maybe best events of the weekend. Certainly challenging, certainly an event in which by the end of it you can look at it and say, yeah, this was a great test that was effective in terms of we had 50 people on the field, so the run was kind of brilliant to get there a little bit spread out by the time they get back into the arena, and certainly by the end of round two on North Park it was kind of clear. Everyone had their own rope, so to speak. Everyone had a barbell if they needed it. And the test was tough. So there was the legless rope climbs and the squat snatches at 185, 130, or 135 for the women. And some people couldn't do the test, and I think that's okay. It was a fair test. Legless rope climb should be expected at the games. 185-pound squat snatch for the men. The comparable weight for the women. If you're coming to the games to do that, whether you're first year, 10th year, whether you're a veteran, whether you're a top 20 open, a sanctional winner, a national champion, I mean, you know that whether you can do those things or not, but certainly it's not out of expectation to be able to do those things. There were a couple big names that got cut in that first event. My feeling about that is that's on them. You guys, you know who they are, and they know who they are. Most of them owned that and said, I just wasn't good enough. And that's exactly right. The test, that wasn't a product of programming or the scoring system or anything like that. That was simply like, man, if you can't place top 75 in that event coming up there, even though you might by the end of the weekend be a top 20, top 30 athlete, too bad. That's when your games deserved to end this year if you couldn't place top 75 in that event. So anyway, moving on from event one. Event two, similarly to event one, was a triplet. Had an aerobic piece, a weightlifting piece, and a high skill gymnastics piece, and I like that. Again, we're cutting a third of the field here, so it's got to be something that's comprehensive, that rewards fitness. If there's anything about event two that I thought was could have been better, was potentially just that, and this is from talking to some athletes, just that this kettlebell standard was new. It was we hadn't really seen that shoulder to overhead standard with the kettlebell before, and so some of the athletes felt like they were getting no reps for the same range of motion that others were getting reps for, but that happens in a lot of events. So overall, didn't have a problem with event two, and you saw what happened with the risk reward in that event. People knew that the cut line was looming. They knew that they had to go for those handstand walks. It was a little bit further than maybe some people practice under that amount of fatigue. And there were some people that didn't, that were punished for that. And if they weren't punished for it directly in that event, for example, Hunter McIntyre he could do those handstand walks. He just risked going up too early, and he got within 4 feet, within 5 feet, and kept falling, and then he was out of the competition. Other people, they made it through this cut, Brent Fikowski, for example, but the points lost there came back to haunt him later on in the competition. So event 2, I liked it. By the end of the first day, we're down to 50 men and 50 women, and there was very little, even though it was sad to see people go, and it was kind of brutal to be at the cuts when they were, announcing those names, and some of the people were very emotional, understandably. I don't think the community in general, I didn't have the feeling that those tests were unfair in any way, that the field that had been cut to 50 was not reflective of fitness in any way. So at the end of day 1, although it was sad to see athletes go, good test. 50 athletes remain. Fine. Friday morning, the teams competition is something we should address before we get to Friday morning. So on the team side of things, they were at 14 to start, and they got 5 full events before they made any cuts. I think this is relevant. I haven't heard many people talk about it, but event 1 for the teams, OC3 Black was 14th. Invictus was 13th. If they had cuts after event 1, surely those 2 teams would have been cut. By the end of the weekend, OC3 Black finished 4th and Invictus finished 3rd. So they were able to prove their fitness over a series of tests, move back up the leaderboard, and slot in to probably where they deserve to be, 3rd and 4th overall respectively. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. Just the individuals are making these cuts event by event all the way through until they got down to 10. Whereas the teams, they gave them 5 events before they started making cuts. They could do that because they had less teams, so it wasn't as imminent to get teams off the field, because it's really hard to run heats of 50, 20, 25, etc. So that's the team competition. I'm not going to talk much about it otherwise, except to say that perhaps we could learn from it in terms of cuts and adapt something or some component of that into the individual competition as changes are made going forward, which we can expect that they will be. We've already seen one. So anyway, event 3 for the individuals was the Ruck Run. And as just in general a fan of CrossFit, events like this need to be included at the games. I know they're not the most spectator friendly. If you're there on site, you see the athletes come in and then they're out, and that's 15 seconds or something, and maybe you want to see more of them in the arena, but you have to keep in mind that we're also testing for the fittest, and so we're always going to see a test like this where it's long, it's endurance, it's grinding, it's grueling. And I had no problem with the inclusion of this event. I didn't have a problem with the inclusion of the event where it was, because it's almost like the starting event of the games in the seasons past. We had 2 events to get the field down to 50. 50 is a number that's pretty close to what we've had before. We've had 40 for a couple years now, but before that, there were 45, there were 47 at the start of, and they had an endurance event early on, fine. And if you can't do that Ruck Run, you shouldn't be at the games, basically. What we saw in this event was we cut to 10. Typically, the athletes who got cut were not the ones who struggled so much on the ruck. For the most part, it was the ones who just hadn't done as well on the events the previous 2 days. After 3 events, on the men's side of things, the top 10 athletes were the top 6 guys by the end of the weekend. So that's Fraser, Noah Olson, BKG, Scott Panchik, Jacob Hepner, James Newberry. And the other 4 people in the top 10 after 3 events were Brent Fikowski, Patrick Vellner, Travis Mayer, and Chandler Smith. I feel like if the field had been cut to 10 right then, that we would have had a better representation in the top 10 of the 10 fittest men in the world than we ended up with. I'm not taking anything away from the guys who ended up replacing those last 4, Fikowski, Vellner, Mayer, and Chandler Smith in the top 10. I'm not even suggesting that all 4 of those guys are definitely the top 10 athletes, but I think that those 4 guys would have performed better over the tests at the end of the weekend than the 4 guys that got in instead of them. Put an asterisk next to Will Morad because he is obviously injured, so I don't know. But that's neither here nor there. At the end of 3 events, we had 40 athletes left, and going on to event 4. So event 4 is where I think that there was kind of a turn in what happened this year at the games. And event 4 is a sprint couplet, so this is a very lightweight sled push across the field. Relatively small number of bar muscle-ups, inconsequential for these athletes, and then sled push back. You may have heard some people, I don't know who, have reported or talked about, or athletes maybe have said some stuff about the inadequacy of doing the sled push tests on the turf field at the games in the past, and also this year there were some athletes who felt like it wasn't the best test. And they thought that it wasn't the best test because of unfair circumstances. The sleds don't push the same on the turf lane to lane. And that might sound ridiculous. I don't know. So I listened to athletes talk about this, and then I went back and I watched the event, on the live feed, world feed, or Rogues coverage, or whatever. Typically, when heats at the games, or really in any sport in which heats are seeded with the best athletes in the middle and then tapering out to the outside, there's a V that's created on the field. So the best athletes work their way to the front, and then as the athletes who are seated lower in the heat are on the outside, they fall behind. Now, you can see this very clearly if you go back and watch the 2-2-2-3 intervals. If you watch the split triplet event that's coming up here in a little bit, this happens very noticeably. In the sled push event this year, 4 out of 4 times, there was an inverted V. So it looked like the outside lanes had a little bit of an advantage. This is on the first sled push. But I was like, I don't know. Like Fraser's went to push his sled, it got dug into the turf, so that wasn't a great, example. He didn't have the same start that the other guys had, and that was on him. But I did a little bit more investigating on this particular event, and I found something that was surprising. On the men's side of things, the top 6 finishers across the 2 heats came out of the same lanes, 2, 7, and 18. So it was like lane 2, lane 7, lane 18, lane 7, lane 18, lane 2 were the top 6 finishers. And on the women's side, the first, second, and third fastest times were in lanes 2, 7, and 18. So just looking at that, it's a small sample size, 4 heats. It just feels like those lanes had an advantage. I don't think that very much time was made up on the bar muscle-ups or lost on the bar muscle-ups. Maybe one bar muscle-up, you can pick up time against someone who's got a little bit longer range of motion or slower cycle speed or whatever. So it appeared to me that it was just simply luck of the draw. If you were in lane 2, 7, or 18, it was a good thing. You're probably going to do better than the other lanes. And there was several lanes in the middle of the field in particular, 8 through 12, where there were very few scores in the top 10. Like lane 12 had 1 out of 4 heats. Lane 10 had 1 out of 4 heats. Those are the best athletes. So either they're bad at pushing a sled, or that lane, for whatever reason, was just more resistant to the sled push. Anyway, we cut some athletes after that heat at that event, and we lost some guys who I was excited about seeing, some girls I was excited about seeing compete a little bit more, but we still hadn't lost the big names. But some of the big names who were in those middle lanes gave up points that again would come back to haunt them later on. Event 5 was Mary. I watched the road coverage back of Mary, and Sean Woodland asks Chase Ingram, he goes, "What's the limiting factor in this event?" And Chase goes, "Height. If you're over 6 feet, it's gonna be a tough event for you." So that's obviously range of motion in this workout is massive. I mean, you can be great at handstand push-ups, you can be great at pistols, you can be great at pull-ups. If you're giving up 1/10 of a second per rep over 600 reps, that's a minute, right? 660, I don't know. It's a lot. So it adds up. So his advantage should be small in this event. Hold on to that thought. Don't get me wrong, Mary's a great test. Fit people should be able to do it. But it's pretty obvious that anyone who knows the sport that the smaller athletes were going to do better on this test. Brent Fikowski, for example, he said, "I was super happy with my Mary performance. I've improved my upper body pulling. I felt comfortable on the handstand push-ups and the pistols. I did a great score on Mary for me. I was never going to beat the small guys." Cut the field down again, and now you've lost a couple guys, a couple names, Ben Smith, Jason Smith, Fikowski, where you start to say, like, man, wow, this is real. This is real. Like, we're really losing some big names here. It's hitting home for some people. We're not going to see these guys compete on the weekend. Okay. Then they announced the sprint event, and that they're cutting to 10. And suddenly, you've got a whole host of athletes, serious competitors for the podium, who are in major jeopardy of not making it to the top 10, because the sprint event is a specialized, sport-specific event. It's and like I said, some of them had lost some points on earlier events that are going to start to be pretty critical right here. So you get to the sprint, they run the sprint event, and sure enough, major cuts terms of big names are made. Katrin Davidsdottir squeaks in, but we lose Sarah Sigmundsdottir. Sarah Sigmundsdottir did not do enough in the earlier events to warrant a spot in the top 10 this year. It was on her. I looked at the numbers. Her average event placement wasn't better than anyone in the top 10. She just wasn't good enough. I don't know what happened to her. I'm sad not to see her on the weekend, but that was on her. And for a couple other athletes, like Fikowski, like Lucas Högberg, that was also the case. Lucas Högberg won one event, but he never finished in the top 15 in any of the others. If you want to make it to the top 10, you have to be better than that. Brent Fikowski's average event placement after 6 events wasn't good enough. After 3 events, it was. Those 3 events weren't great for him. In fact, they weren't great for anyone who was tall. I'll talk about that in a second. But then there were some other athletes. Annie Thorsdottir missed the cut by 6 points. So I was like, man, how did Annie miss this cut? And I look back. Her event placements this weekend were 5th, 6th, 10th, 13th, 13th, and 41st on the ruck run. She said it herself. You can't walk during a run. For someone as experienced as she is, as good as she is, which is with as much training age as she has, she should have been more prepared for that event. She's been in Wisconsin for 3 weeks beforehand. She was acclimated to the heat. I mean, you have to know there's going to be a long-running event. 41st in a heat out of 50 right there. Those are the points she lost on that event. Single-handedly kept her from the weekend. She probably would have been competing for the podium. She might have made the podium. She didn't get a chance to because she couldn't perform on that event. I don't have a problem with that for Annie. Brooke Wells stepped on a line during the sprinting event. People were up in arms about it. She was really upset about it. Watch the video back. It's a clumsy turn. It's a clumsy turn, and it cost her opportunity to compete on the weekend. It's as simple as that. She was good enough across the other events to make it in. She didn't. She just needed to make a sharper cut. Sometimes that happens in sports. Dave said in one of his interviews, these athletes, they're going to look back and there's no one to blame but themselves. They just need to be better. And I think that's the end result that we're going to get, is athletes are actually just going to get better as a result of what happened this weekend. Sometimes sports are cruel. And in the case of Brooke Wells, yeah, I guess that's what it was. Pat Vellner stepped on a line in the sprint event. Potentially it was the thing that kept him out. Except, go back and watch event 1. He said this in an interview himself. He shouldn't have tried to stay with Matt on that event. There was no need to. The points margins were so small in the first event. Yeah, maybe you want to send a message. Maybe it's a mental thing. It's like, no. Look at Noah Olson. He was 12th in the event. He just ran his own race. Pat could have went in his own speed in event 1. He wouldn't have imploded on the snatches in the 3rd and 4th round. He probably would have had a top 5 finish instead of finishing 9th. And those points would have given him the security that he needed, not to go full send on that first sprint, not to make that hectic finish line, step on the line, error. And he would have been around for the weekend. He probably would have gotten 2nd overall, maybe 3rd. Noah did do very, very, very well. So Pat probably would have podiumed again, in my opinion, if he had just been a little bit more methodical in the approach to event 1, not event 6, which is the one where he ended up getting cut. Cole Sager, Travis Mayer, these guys, I mean, dude, the margins that they missed it by, literally Travis Mayer missed by 1/1000th of a second making the top 10. 1/1000th of a second making the top 10. I said it, margins in sports sometimes matter, but did they have to make the cut then, is the question. As you start to get down to some of these names where it was so close, did they have to make the cut then? And I feel like no. I feel like they could have done one more event. And some people said, well, they should have just let him compete the rest of the day. I think one more event would have done the trick. Because the next event, now you're down to 10, was the split triplet. Split triplet is where we get our first chance to see the top 10 athletes who've made it to the weekend. And what you saw in this event was a huge disparity that you would continue to see throughout the course of the events. Matt Fraser lapped either 3 or 4 men in the event. Tia Fraser lapped either 3 or 4 women in the event. Total, there were 7 people lapped in this event. These are the top 10. They're supposed to be the best in the world. They're supposed to be the most competitive. They're supposed to be the ones who've made it this far. And they're getting lapped in a classic CrossFit event. It shouldn't be happening. It just shouldn't be happening. So, you go on to the lifting event. And the lifting event was cool. And yeah, you got to be down to 10 athletes at this point to be able to have an event like this. But as they start the event and the athletes are taking the floor and people are missing the first of 10 barbells, missing the second of 10 barbells, you really start to wonder, have they gotten the right athletes into the top 10? Because I look at the people who were cut in the round of 11 to 20 and the cut in the round of 21 to 30, and I could pick out several athletes in this group that didn't make the cut, who were perfectly capable of doing really well on this event. Now the event goes on, the clean event goes on, and sure enough, by the end of it, we get a really, really great result. We have an epic battle between Tia-Clair Toomey and Amanda Barnhart. We have an epic battle between Matt Fraser and Scott Panchik, and it was great to see. Entertainment, lifting heavyweight, everyone loves it, but I think there are other athletes that could have made that cut who would have been fun to see do that event. And if we had done the split triplet event before we made the cuts instead of just the sprint event, I think we would have got some of those stronger athletes into the field, and that event could have been even more exciting. Now it's end of Saturday. We got one day to go, and the point scoring system is uniform. It is what it is. And now we're talking about the race for the top spot, the race for the podium, and it was cool to see. Yes, Tia was impressive throughout the weekend. She was asserting herself in every realm. It was, and I've heard people use the word ferocious, tenacious. It was scary. It was exciting to watch her, and it really was. On the men's side, we had a surprise. Maybe it comes down to the scoring system. Maybe it comes down to a little bit of a couple events where things didn't go Matt Fraser's way. Specifically, of course, the ruck event. You're talking about the weight falls out of his ruck. People want to know about that. Well, this is all I can say on CrossFit's behalf is, because some people have said, I think Dave had said that they might be assessed a 5-minute penalty if the weight falls out. I don't know if they said that or not, but I know the guys who made this decision about what the penalty should be, and I think that they made the good decision. Someone asked me about it before the penalty was assessed, and I said maybe they just give him a minute penalty. He's pretty close to finish anyway. Yeah, he didn't finish the event with all the weight in his bag, but you're really going to penalize him much harsher than that? It didn't appear to be his fault. Well, he looked over his shoulder. Well, everyone's heard his story by now. Who knows? You're sprinting towards the finish line. You're in the heat of the moment. You don't know what's going on there. So I think we need to all just adapt Matt's mentality for it. They assessed the penalty, and he said, look, it is what it is. I'll take the penalty. I think it was harsher than it could have been, but I also know it was a lot less harsh than the possibility was. So I'll accept it and I'll move on. And that's what you got to do in competition. That's what he did. The sprint sled event didn't go great for him. Low event finish again. And so here we are coming into Sunday, and Noah Olson's got the lead. And a water event coming up. And, if you're talking about excitement and something that people are looking forward to, Matt has said, I'm going for broke on these events. And we think back to the Rich Froning days. We don't get to see him. Dave Castro said this. We don't get to see him go for it on events all that often. He just does what he needs to do to win, to place high enough, to beat the field. Well, in this case, Matt's got to go for it, and he's going for it in a way that perhaps we haven't always seen before. So coming into Sunday, we're excited about that. Water event, it is what it is. There's going to be one at the games. At this point, we can fairly safely assume that. Is it going to be a swim? Is it going to be a paddleboard? Is it going to be a weightlifting or gymnastics component thrown in? Will there be a running? We don't know those things. This year, weightlifting or swimming and paddleboard. And sure enough, you get the guys that you'd expect to do well. The Australians. Tia-Clair Toomey wins the event. I think Matt McLeod probably could have beat her if he wanted to. If you go back and look at his event placements from the sanctioned events he competed in over the year, he was top 2, I think, in both of them in Dubai. He won the paddleboard event in where was that? In Australia. Beat James Newberry in it. Beat James Newberry here again. James did well. Noah did well. Fraser did okay, but he lost ground to Matt. Tia's continued to run away with it. We go into the Coliseum. Everyone thinks, we might have 2 events left. Sure enough, we have 3. Ringer 1, Ringer 2. Love these events. I've heard some people say some weird things about him. Toes to Rings is weird. It's kind of a weird setup. There could have been more creativity. No, I like these sprint events like this, and I like that you have them back to back. They did it with the bi-couplet 1 and 2 last year, where it was really about kind of your grip and gymnastics. This was all about your grit, and your determination, and how much you're willing to suffer and go into that dark place, and can you recover in a couple minutes and do it again. And man, it was cool to see the different strategies that athletes approach this with. Katrin, incredibly impressive in this event. And that's why, I mean, Katrin literally, if Brooke Wells hadn't stepped on the line, Katrin might not have made the top 10. You want to see someone like Katrin in the top 10. You want to see someone like Annie, like Cole Sager, like Pat Vellner, like Travis Mayer, like Brooke Wells. You want to see them in the top 10 because they can do stuff like this. They can show up in these events and just, it's awe-inspiring. It's like, holy cow, what Katrin did in that event. Because James Newberry went for it in event 1 and imploded in event 2. Katrin won them both. That's impressive. That's really impressive, and that's the stuff that people want to see on the weekend. That's what people want to pay the big money to get into the Coliseum to see this drama, this excitement, this athleticism on display. So Fraser does great on these events. Noah doesn't do terribly, 4th and 5th. And people are like, oh, he should have gone for it on one of them. Well, James Newberry, who went for it and won one event, and then really struggled on the second event, got 130 points on those 2 events. Noah, who got 4th and 5th, also got 130 points on those events. So they got the same number of points using different strategies. Fraser, what did he get, 190 points between those 2 events? He overtakes the lead. And at this point, you're pretty much saying, like, it's going to be tough for Noah to beat him, because even if Noah beats him on the last event, he needs several people to come in place, to come in between him and Matt. And because of the field that you have right now, Will Moorhead's withdrawn already with a hamstring injury. Some of these other guys have not been able to challenge Matt at all. Noah's been pretty close to him. You know, he was second in split triplet. And then you come to the final event. It was the standard. Great event. I mean, wow. And incredibly impressive what these men and women can do under fatigue. And when the event's announced, you're basically looking and you're saying, this is trouble for Katrin, who's climbed her way back onto the podium. Has she resolved her muscle-up issue? Answer ended up being, maybe she's gotten better at them, but it wasn't good enough to hold off the likes of Jamie Green, who we know is really good in muscle-ups. That was really where the workout was won or lost for the women. Potentially for the men also, although I think it was more of just a overall capacity thing. You saw Fraser won, Noah was 4 seconds behind him. That was impressive to me. The fact that Noah was, at the end of the weekend, able to be within 4 seconds of Fraser on that event told me that, you know, it wasn't a fluke that Noah podiumed. It wasn't because of the scoring system that Noah podiumed this year. You know, he didn't have the greatest sanctional season. He had his worst open placement, although it was mostly because of 19.1. But he showed up to the games and he was different this year. And it was really nice to see. He wasn't the fittest guy there. Matt is still the fittest. But he was good enough to podium. I think even if you had 20 guys finish the events on, you know, through Saturday and Sunday, he still would have done well enough to make the podium. I was really happy that he was able to do that. And this, you know, brings us to the end of the weekend. And now I'm sitting here reflecting, and I'm wondering to myself, well, did we find the fittest? Yeah, we did. Fraser, Tia, and Mayhem are the fittest. But did you need the games to know that? No. We know they're the fittest. We know they're the fittest. Did we find the second fittest? Did we find the third fittest, the fourth, the 8th, the 12th, the 20th? And this is where I'm sitting there and I'm just have this feeling in my kind of gut, and I'm like, I don't know that we did. I don't know that we found those. I don't feel comfortable this year saying, yeah, James Newberry was the fittest on earth, 5th fittest on earth. Haley Adams was the 6th fittest on earth. Nothing against James and Haley. They had phenomenal weekends. Go look back from the start of the weekend. They were great in the early events. And they earned the right to be in the top 10. Over the course of the test of fitness that we're used to seeing at the CrossFit Games, that's 12, 13, 14, 15 events, would they have held up against the people that we are used to seeing up there? The ones who just barely missed it, the Cole Sagers, who's epic on Sunday, the Pat Vellners, who's never missed the podium in his career, the Brent Fikowskis, who's never been worse than 4th at the games before, the Annie Thorisdaughters, who's got a resume of top 10 finishes behind her. Brooke Wells, consistently in the top 10 in her games career. And we miss seeing him at the games. We miss seeing him on the weekend. I feel like No, we didn't find the third, the fifth, the eighth. I'm just picking random numbers fittest this year. So I looked. I just did a couple analysis, a couple of data things to find out. I'm going to talk to you about them now. The first was I looked at the men in particular who made the final 10, and it seemed to me like their stature was different than what we're used to seeing in the top 10. So 2016, top 10 finishers at the games. Average height, 5'10". Average weight, 196 pounds. 2017, average height of the top 10 men at the end of the weekend, 5'10", 194. 2018, average height and weight of the top 10 men at the end of the weekend, 5'10", again, 195. Over those 3 years of competition, the average height all 3 years was 5'10". The average weight was 195. It was less than half of an inch deviation and less than a pound of deviation over 3 years. These are the athletes we found in the top 10. Of course, we had Fraser all 3 years and he's only 5'7". We had Fikowski all 3 years and he's 6'2". We had guys who weighed less than 195. We had guys who weighed more than 195, but that was the average. This year, the top 10 guys who made the games, the average height and weight was 5'8", 188. That is statistically very significant difference. And remember back to what I said about after event 3, who was in the top 10 compared to who was in the top 10 after event 6. The average height and weight of the men who placed in the top 10 of events 4, 5, and 6 specifically, when the points mattered the most for the cuts, was the same, 5'8", 188. So, those 3 events, their placement in the weekend, statistically affected the people who made the top 10. It's not an emotion thing. It's not a, I feel this way. It was based on the data. That is what it is. Coming into the weekend, people had said the order of events is going to matter. The order of events is going to matter. And coming out of the weekend, sure enough, the order of events mattered. Now, CrossFit has already come out and made a statement and said that they're going to change some things for next year. Or we can assume, well, we already know at least one change. I'm not going to talk about what it is or what I think about it. We'll wait and see what happens this year. They have time to make those decisions, to do their own assessments and reflections on how the games went this year. And they'll get around to releasing the rule book and we'll be able to see. I might not know until pretty close to the games next year the exact format, but I'm sure that they will make improvements to it. It was the first year of a system. Is it an excuse to have something like this happen? I don't know. But I think that the result for the athletes is going to be that they will be better, and therefore we'll get a better show next year. Hopefully CrossFit makes a couple adjustments so we get to see the athletes who have improved and who have addressed some of this stuff for the full weekend. But I think that positives are coming from what happened this year. Notably, since I brought up the men, there was no statistical difference in height in the women in those events or in the top 10 this year. There was the average height of the women in the top 10 for the past 4 years now, this year plus the last 3 years, was all 5'4" point something. And the weight was a little less this year, it was 139 instead of 142 or 143, which it had been in the past couple of years. So it was less statistically significant than the men, but on the men's side that was so noticeable that I felt like it was worth mentioning. The other thing was, and the guys on Talking Elite Fitness talked about this a little bit, the average event placements of certain athletes that got cut, specifically when they made the final cut to 10, was different. I mean, there were some athletes who had a lower average event placement than people who got in. On the men's side, there were 4 athletes with lower average event placements across those 6 events than 3 athletes who made the top 10. And on the women's side, there were 4 athletes who had lower event placements across those 6 events than only one of the women who made the top 10. The reason for this was because of how the points were weighted early on. And so to make a long story short, I have some spreadsheets that go into depth on this. Basically, you were punished more for a poor event placement in events 4, 5, and 6 than you were in events 1, 2, and 3. One example, Matt McLeod took 41st and 44th on the first 2 events, and he wasn't punished that harshly for them. He did very well on events 4, 5, and 6, winning one of them, top 10s in the other 2, and he was able to make up those points. There were 5 guys, I think the first 5 guys that got cut, none of them had an event placement worse than Matt McLeod's 2 event placements on event 1 and 2, but the timing of when he did well compared to when he didn't is what mattered for him and what mattered for those guys. So anyway, that's an event by event walkthrough of some of the things that I know, some of the things I saw, some of the things that I learned about the CrossFit Games 2019. I know it's a long video. If you made it through, great. I appreciate that. If you think that it's valuable, share it with some of your friends or whatever. And yeah, I'd love, if you guys have any thoughts on it, you can always reach out to me. I try to do a good job of interacting with you. I tried to find a platform to get this stuff out on, but I ultimately was only able to do it on my own this time. So appreciate you guys listening. Hopefully, like me, you're just fans of the sport who want to see it get better and better. And I am hopeful that CrossFit's aware of the conversations that are going on. It was a good test this year. I think they can improve within the format that they're striving for. The inclusion of the national champions is, in my opinion, is fine. Cuts are fine. Scoring system is what it is. I don't think it would have been a huge factor if they just made one or two minor changes middle of the week or middle of the weekend. And I think that there's a good chance we'll see something like that next year. So anyway, thanks again.